Yeah, this one's for the workers who toil night and day, by hand and by brain, to earn your pay, who for centuries on past for no more than your bread, have bled for your countries and counted your dead.
You're listening to WLPN 105.5 FM Chicago, and you're listening to Labor Express Radio, Chicago's only English language labor news and current affairs radio program. News for working people, by working people. I'm your host, Jerry Mead Lucero, and this is the Sunday, October 21st, 2018 edition of Labor Express. So if you've been listening to the last couple of programs, you know that I've been talking about how I'm going to be doing these kind of macro level view programs. I started that with my last episode, a discussion of UBI, Universal Basic Income. We will be continuing that series, and our next program in 2 weeks will be looking at the shortening of the working week, which IG Metall was able to get in their recent contract. I have an interview with Mark Bergfeld about that issue, and we'll definitely be continuing over the next few months these kind of big picture type of episodes. But I'm back in Chicago this weekend, somewhat unexpectedly, and I was able to get into the studio here to do a live program, and the timing couldn't be better because really one of the most important labor stories in recent years, the really betrayal by James Hoffa and the leadership of the Teamsters of their members at UPS with this recent contract, and we'll talk more about what we mean by that soon, is something that we really have to discuss. And so I've been lucky enough to get Joe Allen, author of The Package King, a rank and file history of United Parcel Service, a former UPS employee and member of the Teamsters as well. And I'm going to have him on after our opening Solidarity News segment. And we'll be spending the whole program talking about how important this is, not only for the people that work at UPS, but really for the entire working class in this country as well. So we'll be getting into that more. It also ties in actually with a lot of the themes that we're talking about in kind of the macro level programs. One of the programs I've mentioned that I'm hoping to have in the next few months is an interview with Kim Moody about his new book on New Terrain, how capital is reshaping the battleground of the class war. And a big portion of that book is about the centrality of the logistics industry right now in terms of working class power. And UPS is right at the center of that as well. So we'll bring that up when we talk with Joe. I should also mention that I'm lucky enough to have Andrew Friend back too from Labor Beat TV. He's going to be also helping me talk with Joe about this very important issue. But before we do all that, we have our international labor news update from our friends at Radio Labor based in Canada. This particular episode of Solidarity News is also very relevant. It's actually talking about the National Marriott Hotel Strike, which is underway right now by United HERE. This is actually an interesting follow-up to one of the stories that we've been running on the program in the last couple of months, which is the Chicago Hotel Strike, which is almost ended at this point. There's 26 hotels have already signed contracts. The Cambria Hotel Chicago Magnificent Mile is the last holdout right now. There are two hotels, the Hotel Raffaello, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, and the Tremont Chicago Hotel on Magnificent Mile, which apparently could go on strike at a future time, but they're not at this point. But for the most part, United HERE Local 1 has been very successful. The real key issue for them has been this issue of year-round health care, because the workers will get cut off at the health care during the slow season. And they basically, all the hotels that they've got a contract with now, they've won that demand. But at the same time that the Chicago hotel strike is wrapping up, the national strike against Marriott hotels, which has its own separate issues, is currently underway. So let's hear from Solidarity News.
This is Solidarity News on Radio Labor.
This is a Radio Labor report recorded on Thursday, October 18th, 2018. I'm Mark Boulanger. With the slogan, "One job should be enough," More than 7,000 employees of Marriott hotels in the United States are on strike for better pay and working conditions. The workers include housekeepers, banquet staff, bartenders, and other service workers. The strikes, which started at the end of August, have hit hotels in 9 cities, including Detroit, Boston, San Francisco, and Maui. Marriott owns 6,000 hotels, making it the largest hotel chain in the world. In 2017, it earned $30 billion. Steve Zeltzer of the Labor Video Project in the U.S. interviewed some of the workers walking the picket lines in San Francisco.
So they haven't really been taking our demands seriously for job security and what we consider as economic fairness. We have talked about so many of us have to work multiple jobs just to make ends meet, especially to live in the Bay Area, and we don't think that should be something that's normal. We know that it's within the power and within the resources of the Marriott to be able to support their workers such that they are able to make one job enough. And we've said that from the very beginning, but they have not taken us seriously. And every time we ask them, we've even made moves. We've tried to be like, hey, we'll meet you halfway. We'll meet you somewhere. We get nothing, or we get derision, or like this funny looks that they give us,
Miguel Medina.
What, do you work at the Marriott?
I do. I'm going on 15 years.
What kind of work do you do?
I'm a banquet houseman. I do the setup and breakdown for the events.
And why do you think the Marriott is refusing to agree to your demands?
And it's not like we're asking for a lot. We're only asking for what we deserve. The reason Marriott is successful is because of all of us. We're the ones that make Marriott successful. So we deserve a little bit more because we live in a city that we can't afford to live in the city. Even though we work in the city, we cannot afford to live in the city.
And how do you live? I mean, with the prices.
Me and my wife, we both have to work 2 jobs, and we still have trouble sometimes paying the bills. Especially around this time, a lot of our union brothers and sisters will have to go out and look for a second job because the holidays are coming around. The business is going down, so we have no choice. We have to go out. Some of us have to look for 3 jobs. 2 is not enough sometimes.
And if you have a family, how can you have a life when you're working 2 or 3 jobs?
My wife, she always tells me, we need to work, but it's not the most important. Family is the most important. I wish I had time to spend with my children every day instead of going to 2 jobs. I leave in the morning, my kids are still asleep. I come back at night, my kids are already sleeping. I cannot see them unless Saturday or Sunday. It's not enough.
How long have you worked for Marriott?
I've worked for Marriott 29 years.
Long time.
Yes.
They also fought the union for a long time?
Oh, yes, they did, and I was part of that organizing.
What happened in that?
Well, we went out on a 2-day strike then, and, it took a boycott for Marriott to really just open their eyes and, want to get serious with us, and we were able to attain a contract as a result.
So this solidarity of hotel workers, it seems like it's spreading nationally and internationally.
It is a national campaign, and, we believe that, with this hotel being the largest chain in the world, our employment with the Marriott, 1 job should be enough. This is my employer, and we should not have to go out and get 2nd and 3rd jobs in order to support our families.
And that's it. International labor news you can use. You can find more labor news on our website at www.radiolabor.net. Follow us on Twitter at Radio Labor. I'm Mark Boulanger. Thank you for listening. And remember, it's all about global solidarity.
And you're listening to Labor Express Radio News for working people by working people, and that was our weekly international labor news update from Solidarity News, produced by Radio Labor in Canada. For more on Radio Labor, see their website at radiolabor.net. It was interesting to hear, too, of course, in that piece, a good friend of Labor Express Radio, Steve Zeltzer, was the interviewer there in California. So Steve has been a big friend of Labor Express for many years, so it's good to hear his voice, too. So I want to move on to talk with my guests here. As I mentioned earlier, I've got 2 guests. I got Andrew Friend from Larrabee TV, who's going to be helping out with the interview today. And then I've got Joe Allen, who's the author of The Package King, a rank-and-file history of the United Parcel Service, came out a few years ago. He's also the author of a recent article in Jacobin magazine online, which I think is really a perfect description of what's going on right now with this UPS Teamsters contract. It's titled James Hoffa's Anti-Democratic UPS Catastrophe. The very opening line here of the article says, Teamsters leader James Hoffa has ratified a UPS contract despite a member vote that rejected it. This sabotage is not only a catastrophe for UPS Teamsters, it's a gift to anti-union forces. That really, I think, sets the stage here for what we're going to be talking about. So let me start off. Joe, welcome. Thanks for being
Jerry.
here.
Thanks for having me.
And Andrew, thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
We just finished this piece, too, about the hotel strike, and you couldn't have more of a contrast right now, right?
Right.
You've got this really successful hotel strike that's wrapping up here in Chicago. Hopefully they'll have the same success with the Marriott strike nationally. United HRE seem well prepared for this. They really mobilize their members. They really mobilize their allies. One of the things I keep hearing about the reason for the success of the Chicago strikes was the amount of cross-union solidarity. The various building trades and so on refused to go into those hotels during the strike here in Chicago. It was a really, fairly good case study of how to do things right. And I'm not. Please understand, all the people that are listening to my coverage of the hotel strike, I'm not belittling the hotel workers at all when I say this, but I'm just saying, as important as that is, and it's an important service sector strike, right? A strike at UPS could have been economy changing, could have been affected the working class in a whole other level. And they voted, of course, 90% to go on strike several months ago as the contract negotiations were going on. But I'll let you explain, Joe, what's happened in this last couple weeks.
Well, I think, if you pull back the lens to this whole year, like you were talking about, Jerry, is that this is really going to go down in the history books as a year where the strike was rediscovered by American workers. And even more importantly, it was rediscovered by teachers in what have been called the red states, the pro-Trump states. And in many cases, those teachers or the families of those teachers voted for Trump themselves. And yet what we saw starting in West Virginia and then spreading to Oklahoma and then to Arizona and then to many other places across the country is a rediscovery of not just simply the strike weapon, which is important in itself, but that many of these strikes were very political strikes,
right,
where the issues were not just their immediate wages and working conditions, and of course they all said that was important, but also issues of the funding of the schools, the care of the children. So this is a year where not only have we rediscovered the strike, but American workers have taken up quite militant demands and quite political demands, which is not something that, most people in this country or most people around the world, how they view American workers. Right. And so when, you come to a company like UPS, which is the largest private sector unionized employer in the country, holding a position that is somewhat akin to what General Motors used to hold in the United States when it was the largest unionized employer. That obviously a struggle and a fight at a company like that has the potential to carry the struggles that have begun by the teachers, and then by the hotel workers and by others, to carry it to an even higher level.
Right.
And the fact that this was sabotaged by the Hoffa leadership of the Teamsters Union is really a black mark against not just simply Hoffa and his supporters, but is really a gift to, in this era of the Janus Supreme Court decision, a real gift to anti-union forces in this country, which are quite strong in corporate America, but are quite strong politically all across the United States. I mean, can you imagine a situation where somebody's trying to organize a union, particularly if you're trying to organize a union into the Teamsters, where, the employer just has to put out a leaflet saying, well, here's these out-of-touch bureaucrats who make hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, and all your dues money does is go to them, and when you vote for something you don't want, they tell you can't have it. Well, you can't think of a better scenario for anti-union forces. Right. I would also just add to that, of course, that one of the big issues, of course, in future organizing in this country, because we do have a labor movement, despite the strikes that have taken place this year, that is in a really dire condition. Both public sector unions, have lost a huge Supreme Court decision earlier this year, but private sector unions, for the most part, most of the economy has become deunionized, and the burgeoning logistics section of the economy, typified by Amazon, who's now one of the largest private sector employers in the country, along with companies like FedEx and a whole slew of much smaller local and regional companies, are major non-union employers and should be organized into unions like the Teamsters. And the fact that, a Teamster negotiated contract, which Hoffa is now going to impose on a membership that voted it down, only starts part-timers at $13 an hour, while Jeff Bezos, at least granted $15 an hour without a union to at least some section of his workforce is frankly embarrassing. I just don't know how you describe it any other way.
And I want to come back to that particular point too, again, because it's so essential to talk about how destructive this could be to organized labor. Let's go back just a second, just to go through the what exactly happened. So there was the vote was taking place over a course of at least a couple months over the summer, right, or at least August. Or no, September, and then the vote count was held just a few weeks ago. And if I understand correctly, there's kind of two parts of the contract, right? One was voted down by the members by 55%, the other by 65%. Can you talk a little bit about what happened there?
Well, like I mentioned earlier, is that UPS is the largest private sector unionized employer in the country, and that's mostly and overwhelmingly the Teamsters. There are some other unions that represent sections of UPS employees, like the pilots are in a different union, the Independent Pilots Association, and the mechanics are sometimes in the machinists, and there's also a large section of the mechanics who are also represented by a national local of the Teamsters. But most of the workforce is at UPS is in the Teamsters, and 200 in the division that people are most familiar with, which is the UPS package division, the people who do home deliveries or deliveries to your office, the brown trucks that are pretty ubiquitous on America's streets these days. There's about 260,000 of those workers, both part-timers, package car drivers, feeder drivers, and various categories of combination full-time workers who are covered by the national contract. UPS Freight, which was formerly known as Overnight, which you can easily find out a lot of information about, was one of the most notorious non-union, union-busting companies in the country. And back about 10 years ago, UPS bought it, and it's been rebranded UPS Freight. In a deal that was cut between Hoffa and UPS, Hoffa agreed to take the UPSers out of the Central States Pension Fund in exchange for the Teamsters getting card check recognition. So, Hoffa has a long history of making terrible deals at UPS. And UPS Freight represents somewhere between 15 and 20,000 people. The numbers fluctuate a little bit because of one seasonal hiring, sometimes because of, a high turnover rate, particularly at UPS Freight. Even at UPS Package, there's an annual turnover rate that's almost 90% among part-timers, and part-timers still represent about 60% of the workforce. There's a national contract that's negotiated every 5 years in both places. 5 years ago, the major issue of contention between the rank and file and the company and UPS was over healthcare concessions, a new plan called Team Care. That the Teamsters would administer. It was sold as a purely administrative change. It wouldn't be a benefits change. Well, when people went to use it, they found something different. And, 5 years ago, the national contract was almost defeated. It passed with a bare majority, and yet the local supplements, which are kind of local contracts that covered the amount of jobs to be created, sometimes health care benefits, sometimes, other things related to job issues that are not covered by the national contract. Many of those were voted down and repeatedly voted down by the rank and file. And Hoffa did a similar thing 5 years ago, is that after about 10 months, Hoffa imposed the contract on everyone, because you can't implement the national contract until all of the supplements are ratified. So after 10 months of rank and filers voting down all the supplements, he just used his authority to impose the contract on the membership. Now, over the last year, there's been a big, campaign to get real improvements in the UPS contract. And in fact, a lot of the initial demands put forward by Hoffa and his chief negotiator, Dennis Taylor, were actually pretty good. There was some very tough and clear language on, introducing new technology that might lead to job loss, and many other things. So people were kind of cautiously optimistic, despite being completely suspicious of the way the leadership acted 5 years ago. And what became very clear during the course of contract negotiations is that all the initial tough proposals disappeared. The issues of trying to rectify some of the problems around healthcare from the last contract disappeared, and the union itself actually proposed a major concession, creating these things called hybrid drivers, which would deliver ground packages like that are done by full-timers right now, and the other half of the day workers would do something else. It was going to be a new two-tier system. They would work weekends without overtime pay. And many people really smelled a rat in this proposal, that this was the beginning of breaking up full-time package car driving jobs, which are one of the shrinking islands of high-paid blue-collar industrial jobs in this country. Hoffa and Taylor tried to sell this as a way of dealing with the burdensome and crushing overtime that many full-time package car drivers have. They're out 10, 12 hours a day, and so forth. And most people didn't fall for that ploy so much. In fact, it kind of blew up in Hoffa and Taylor's face. But there was also a myriad of other concessions or weak language on subcontracting, the fact that part-time pay wasn't going to go up substantially, and many other issues. And I think a kind of general anxiety about the continued decline of the union at what is obviously a growing and fabulously profitable company. I mean, I can't even think of a year that UPS ever lost money. So, when the contract was tentatively agreed to back in early July, the Teamsters gave a contract extension so they could go into a voting period. And over the course of a month in August and mostly in September, people began campaigning against it. The people who took the lead in opposing it were Teamsters for a Democratic Union, the long-standing reform group in the Teamsters, and Teamsters United, which was the opposition campaign led by Fred Zuckerman that nearly defeated Hoffa in the 2016 election. People were cautiously optimistic. They had a sense that the contract at UPS Freight, which is substantially worse than anything proposed at UPS Package, would be voted down. But it wasn't entirely clear what would happen at UPS Package because, frankly, it's been many years since the Teamsters had conducted a national strike against UPS, even though the vote in early June showed that there was a substantial support for such an idea. When the votes came in on October 5th, I, like a lot of other people, thousands of others who were listening online or on the phone, immediately realized, and it was announced, that both contracts had been voted down, and very clearly voted down. And then within a sentence or two, Dennis Taylor, who was presiding over the ceremony, announced that they had been, quote, ratified. This, of course, seemed confusing to most people, but not entirely surprising. A few days before the vote count and the announcement of results, Taylor, at a national grievance panel hearing in San Diego, had announced that unless a certain threshold, that more than 50% of the people at UPS actually voted, that they would have a one-sided interpretation of this constitutional language in the union that would allow Hoffa to impose the contract that requires a 2/3 vote. And this is exactly what they did. Mm-hmm. So if you were watching the social media response to the contract vote like I did, you saw many of the people who campaigned against the contract. There was a moment of elation. We did it. We won. We beat them. And you took on both the company and the union, who, carried out a full court press to get this passed. And that's a hard battle to win at a company where there's 260,000 people who work, in many cases, work 24 hours a day in all sorts of obscure places around the country. And then as soon as Taylor announced that it was ratified, the question marks and what's happening and so forth. And then, of course, just raw fury over the next 24 hours as it became clear that they were just going to go against the democratic wishes of the membership and impose this rotten deal on the membership.
We only have about 5 minutes for the break, but Andrew, I want to make sure you get a chance to get in here. So do you want to?
Yeah, I think most members of most unions in this country, having heard that they had verified that the contract had been voted down, or any contract that they're currently voting on, and then for some reason that still equals, the contract is ratified, these negotiations and these votes are over, they'd be flabbergasted by that. Like, how is that possible? I thought that was why we were voting, so that we could have the right to say yes or no to the contract that the boss proposed and that our so-called leaders negotiated. You were saying that it's a constitutional clause in their constitution, but you mentioned in your article that's supposed to be for a final offer. For those who've negotiated labor contracts with their employer, the last, best, and final offer is like a regulated term from the NLRB, after which you can go to like arbitration and stuff like that. Before we came on, it sounds like, Joe, you were just saying that no, it's just written that the boss, the union, can pretty much interpret it the way he wants. And I think most unionists would be so shocked to learn that even exists. I mean, are we looking at the final sort of breaking down of the anti-democratic tradition in the Teamsters? Is this the sort of the last straw for an organization like a slate like Teamsters United to finally win in the next election, and on a slate of, I promise I will remove that thing from our Constitution and always listen to the members?
Just like we got 4 minutes before the break, but go ahead if you could respond to that, Joe.
Well, I mean, clearly, the Hoffa's decision, which really is just a kind of one-sided interpretation of the language, but of course the courts have always deferred to union officers about how they interpret their own constitutional language on these things. It's terrible, because you see it's a window into, really, despite the fact that the Teamsters are one of the largest unions that directly elects its top officers, because most unions don't do that. Most unions, they're elected at conventions, and it's kind of a club of officers who elect another club of officers to run the unions, right? It's a very closed world. And it's because of the historic work of Teamsters for a Democratic Union that the right to vote was won in the late 1980s, and the first rank-and-file elected reform leader was Ron Carey, who, not surprisingly, then led the most important strike in 30 years in 1997, when he called the national strike against UPS. Right. So democracy usually equals militancy, which is what both the old guard and the Teamsters and what corporate America knows. And so they're very hostile to democracy, both of them. I think, it's not unique, however, to the Teamsters, is that the American labor movement in general is extremely undemocratic, gives officers a lot of authority to do things either independent or against the wishes of the rank and file. And I'm sure there are many people out there who know that experience from both the building trades and from unions like SEIU.
Right. We're going to get more into some of the real implications of this for the labor movement as a whole, both what's in this contract that's so dangerous for unions. You talked about the whole thing in comparison to Amazon. We'll talk about that more later on. And I also want to talk about, too, like what are the next steps here in terms of those within the Teamsters that want to fight back on this. But we do have a break coming up. Are we going to go to break right now, and we'll come back? Okay, so we'll be back in just a few minutes. And you're listening to Labor Express, Radio Chicago's only English language labor news and current affairs radio program. I'm your host, Jerry Mead Lucero, and I have in studio today Joe Allen, who's the author of The Package King, a rank-and-file history of United Parcel Service, and a recent article in Jacobin, James Hoffa's Anti-Democratic UPS Catastrophe, which we're talking about today. I also have Andrew Friend, producer for Labor Beat TV, who's here as well to talk with Joe. So before the break, you mentioned the fact that one of the reasons that this contract was so opposed by the members was this issue of this development of this two-tier approaches, a part of the labor force. Just for those that might not be too familiar with two-tier setups, this is really one of always the most dangerous things to union solidarity, right? Because what you're doing is you're creating a class of employees who are getting less pay, getting less protections and benefits and so on than these other workers. And so it creates this dynamic within the workforce where, the people are getting, I don't know if the word. Well, I want to avoid using a word that I shouldn't be using on the air here. Who are not getting the benefits of the union feel like, why should I be in a union if it's going to treat some of the workers well and I'm going to get messed up. Is the word I'm going to use. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, UPS is a company that's been around for a long time. In fact, it's probably one of the oldest companies that's still operating under the same name and brand or similar brand. They did a big public rebranding about 15 years ago that was a little silly, but, operating under the same name for a long time. It's been organized by the Teamsters for, over 80 years, starting on the West Coast. And so there's always been a very close relationship between the Teamsters and the UPS. And, of course, for years, UPS was kind of a marginal part of the Teamsters union because the way the trucking industry evolved and the way the Teamsters organized it is that, UPS was known as Parcel Post, and the industry was very regulated on a federal and a state level. So the, UPS grew by, one state after another. It would move into, it would take over certain businesses, develop and prosper. And so it wasn't until 1976 that actually UPS became a company that represented the 48 contiguous states of the United States, which is fairly recent history. I mean, I was 16 in 1976. So 1976 isn't some ancient time. And during that time, the Teamsters grew with UPS. And so it went from being a kind of marginal presence in the Teamsters, where they were kind of mocked for wearing these kind of silly brown uniforms and having to wear bow ties. In fact, there was a strike once in Kentucky to get rid of the plastic bow tie that you had to wear in the summertime. And UPSers had to actually fight to wear shorts because it was so miserable in the hubs and out on the streets. But they were mocked by other Teamsters as not being real Teamsters, not being real drivers. I mean, the Teamster still has a lot of silly macho culture to it, but back then it was just it was worse in a lot of ways. But by the 1970s, UPS had emerged, according to I believe it was Fortune magazine at the time, who dubbed them the quiet giant of the package deliveries industry. So, for a company that did no advertising, right, it quietly snuck up on all of its rivals, including the post office, and it began. So by the early 1970s, it employs over 100,000 Teamsters. During the 70s, the 80s, and 90s, into the present time, it employs over 260,000 Teamsters. And while the rest of the trucking industry that was deregulated after 1980, many of the most oldest and venerable and long-standing union and Teamster employers literally either consolidated to survive or in most cases completely disappeared. So within the Teamsters union, UPS goes from a marginal company to being almost a union within a union. So if you take the figures that are given by the Teamsters, there's 1.4 million Teamsters in the United States. Well, 280,000 of them work at UPS. So try to imagine what the Teamsters as a union would be if UPS didn't exist. It would be a marginal ramshackle union in a lot of ways that would represent, in most cases, dying freight companies. I mean, that's to put it bluntly. Well, in the 1980s, the American labor movement began to make, in most cases, unnecessary concessions to major employers. It began with the bailout of the New York City government in the mid-1970s, Chrysler in 1979, and UPS, most notoriously, and this is really the origins of the two-tier stuff at UPS, most notoriously demanded that start pay for part-timers who were growing not only as an absolute number inside of UPS, but in terms of the percentage of the workforce, because UPS is wiping out full-time jobs while creating a whole army of part-timers, demanded that the start pay, which in most parts of the country were around $11 or $12 an hour, to be cut to $8 an hour. So this became like the secret subsidy for UPS's expansion over the next 25 years, is this enormous part-time workforce working for less money in highly exploitative situations. And really that sort of began the process of, where, the old demand of unionists is you do the same work, you get the same pay,
right,
where there's a myriad of pay scales and wage scales. And when I got my first time, full-time job at UPS, I was a combination worker. So I was a part-time ad driver, and I worked in the hub as a sorter. And I was getting wildly different pay rates for about the first 4 hours I worked and the last 4 hours I worked. The hybrid driver issue, I think, brought back that whole unfairness of several different wage scales operating at the same time for people, because it was such an attack on what people really want at UPS, which is that most people who go and put up with years and years of hard work at odd hours and physically demanding and difficult conditions, they want to get a full-time package car driver job and eventually get into a feeder job so you can actually make a wage that you can support a family and have a future with. So the hybrid driver issue of having people work part-time in package and part-time something else meant that they were going to have a much lower pay scale. They would probably never catch up to a regular full-time package car driver. They would work weekends with no overtime to them. And so for a lot of people, this became a kind of red emergency light that went on to say to people, this has just got to stop.
What I think is really interesting too, I want to point out real quick, and Andrew, I want to get you into. I apologize that I not getting in enough here, but is the contrast. Mm-hmm. So between this contract where we basically have the creation of another two-tier system which breaks down solidarity, right, among workers, and the fight in '97, which you referenced earlier, right, the last big strike at UPS by the Teamsters when Ron Carey was in the leadership of the union, with their reformers were in the leadership of the union, where they built the entire strike around, part-time America won't work. Right. We're gonna limit the part-time jobs and try to get everybody full-time jobs, and the whole focus was building solidarity. Everybody gets paid the same, everybody gets the same benefits. The contrast couldn't be stronger.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I mean, you got to remember, when you go back to '97 and the '97 strike, is that was a result of several important movements and campaigns coming together that took a long time to bring together. I mean, there's Ron Carey's story that he was a fairly unique figure in the Teamsters. He surprisingly, he actually worked as a Teamster, in contrast to so many Teamster officials who never actually worked as Teamsters. In many cases, they're the sons of Teamster officials. They're the juniors, as I would call them, right? The permanent bureaucracy of sons and fathers, and in some cases daughters. Ron Carey worked as a package car driver. His father worked as a package car driver at UPS. So, the Carey family went back to the 1930s having a very intimate knowledge of what it was like to work at UPS. Ron Carey came to leadership in the local 804 in New York, which is still the largest UPS local in New York City, in 1968. And he led a series of, many strikes over the years and fights with the company. And he was also a very honest and forthright man, and was never tainted with the corruption of the Teamsters, which was notorious, and especially in that era of the 1960s and 70s. And so there's Ron Carey's story. And, of course, he was totally isolated within the union officialdom because of that during those years. And he opposed all those policies, but he could do very little to stop them. There's also the story of the Teamsters for a Democratic Union, which, begins in the 1970s. It comes out of the rank and file radical movements of the 1970s. The International Socialists was one of the groups that helped launch TDU. And then there's also the story of Upsurge, which was the sort of radicals, in many cases women activists, who began this kind of movement at UPS in the mid-1970s. And during the course of the 1980s, a lot of these individuals, campaigns, and movements struggled because, to survive and then to move forward, because the massive changes in the trucking industry, obviously completely reorganized everything, with UPS becoming the largest freight company in the country. when the right to vote was won because of years of campaigning against by TDU against the government oversight. Remember, the government initially wanted to put the teachers into a trusteeship and have an appointee run it. Can you imagine what an appointee from the Reagan and Bush administration would have done when negotiating contracts? So, all these come together in 1991 when Ron Kerry won the presidency in the union, which really was a bombshell that went off in both the labor movement and in corporate America. And it was this whole idea of, oh my God, the militants have taken over. I mean, that was really their view of things. And of course, UPS went into a panic about this sort of stuff. Their best friends, UPS's best friends, were really the old guard of the union, the old mobbed up officials who were used to a cozy relationship that they benefited from. They opposed Kerry on everything that he did. And the person who took the lead in that, who became their face, was James Hoffa, James P. Hoffa Jr., the son of the famous Teamster leader who disappeared in 1975 and has been presumed dead for many years now. After the 97 strike, there was a political witch hunt against Kerry, and he was driven out of the union. He was later found not guilty in federal court of the very same things that he was driven out of the union for. But Hoffa took over the union and began to remake it in his own image in Transport Topics, which is the main magazine for the freight industry. One of their first editorials about Hoffa in terms of UPS was "In Love with Hoffa." So that love that UPS has had for Hoffa has been very bad for the Teamster rank and file for these past 2 decades. And so the recent events with Hoffa, for many long-standing activists who have been both familiar with him and familiar with the 97 strike, aren't surprising. But I think that anybody in the Teamsters who had any lingering ideas about what the Hoffa name might have meant for them, I think is now buried.
Joe, when I think about the world we live in now, where what they used to call e-commerce, this fringe thing, is
now it's just commerce.
Yeah, right. Now it's I don't know about numbers, but it feels like it's the way the majority of people buy stuff nowadays, or at least they buy something online and have it shipped to their address. It seems to me that anybody who's part of a union that's doing any kind of shipping to individual homes is in a more powerful position now than they've really ever been. I guess maybe at the height of the Sears Roebuck catalog might have been your only other comparison, but the big three that I can think of that deliver to homes individuals: FedEx, the United States Postal Service, and UPS. 2 out of 3 of those are unionized. I can't remember the last thing I ever heard anybody say something terrible about FedEx, but you hear the UPS and USPS bashing every day. And with so much, and it isn't just individual stuff being shipped all around the country, and like individual people are buying stuff on Amazon or whatever that's literally coming to them from China. And this is also the era, of course, of just-in-time manufacturing, where manufacturers don't keep massive warehouses of parts anymore. They have that stuff shipped directly from the people that are making it, literally just in time, within a couple of days of needing it. So they don't have to keep massive inventories. And all of that depends upon truck drivers and railroad workers and longshoremen unloading the ships.
And pilots.
And pilots, too. So if we were not in a world where a corrupt old guard of a union with authoritarian power can impose contracts, what would it look like if we had unions that could say, we're actually really powerful here with our hands on all these choke points? What kind of contract should a UPS and a USPS look like?
Let me just add to that real quick, and basically reiterating what you're saying, which is, we talked about how important UPS is to the Teamsters because of the size, and that's certainly important, number one, largest private employer in the country. But it's not just the size; it's this issue of them being at the choke point of the economy, the potential power they have to transform working conditions for all workers in this country is what makes this just devastating, that this is what's going on.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, you sit there and you say, I wrote an article earlier this year where I said that the way the Teamsters should be approaching this contract is we should be getting the best deal we can get, because it should be a model contract for how to then go to FedEx and Amazon and to use that to organize them. Right. And of course, what you're going to get is you're going to get the complete boomerang opposite effect because of this catastrophe with Hoffa, or potentially that catastrophe with Hoffa. I think if you pull back the lens, you have to say that, for the whole history of, industrial capitalism, I mean, it's just true of, commercial capitalism too, but, transport workers have been always very important to how the system works. In the 19th century, obviously, it was, railroad workers, even though railroad workers are absolutely essential today. Right. We just don't think of them in the same way. But, you think of the big strikes by railroad workers, the 1877 railroad strikes, which was, probably the closest the United States ever came to a workers' revolution. Right. The Pullman strike that was led by Eugene Debs. These capture our imagination because they literally put not just the question of industrial struggle and the particular issues of those strikes on the agenda, but they showed the potential power of those workers, not just to shut down society, but maybe even to transform it. Right. Waterfront workers, have always played a very important role because of the unloading of ships, and as trade has become more global, that's true. So you think back to the 1930s, particularly the San Francisco waterfront strikes and general strikes that the dockers have been, absolutely essential to the system and the building the labor movement. The Teamsters, was always a very important union, but, with the massive expansion of the American highway system and the freight industry in the post-World War II era, the Teamsters becomes the most powerful, along with the UAW, I would say, the two most powerful unions, certainly in the country. And and that's really the era that they identify with Hoffa's father, Jimmy Hoffa, right? The much mythologized Jimmy Hoffa. But there's also an important kernel of truth about the power of the Teamsters union at that time. And I don't think it's an accident that when you look at both railroad workers, waterfront workers, throw in the airlines, throw in the Teamsters, that all of these sections of workers or industries have been subject to the most severe and repressive federal regulation and political witch hunts against their leaders. After all, people like Debs were thrown in jail and then prosecuted for leading the strikes. Harry Bridges, who led, the waterfront strikes in the 30s and led the union through the 40s on the West Coast, was basically under continuous investigation for 20 years. Jimmy Hoffa, Sr., who undoubtedly committed real crimes, but Congress commits real crimes every day, and he went to prison for it because they saw the Teamsters union as a very powerful union. And in that tradition, it's no mistake that somebody like Warren Carey, after leading the UPS strike, is once again subject to political persecution. In his case, he was vindicated from it. All of these, I think, what changes today about the whole composition of the transport industry and the economy is that, as opposed to sort of old-fashioned warehousing and distribution, that logistics these days is really about the whole management of these global supply chains. When you think of things like Walmart or Target or Amazon, these are global chains that manage whole supply chains. And so the ability of workers to shut them down, or potential of workers to shut them down, is much more has much more of a global effect, and that type of potential power has to be smothered and disorganized by both the employers and their friends in the government. So when I look at what's the outcome of this move by Hoffa to impose this contract, is that first of all, it's a disaster for UPSers. It just means that UPSs all across the country mean that they're going to have to take on both the union and the company every time they want to fight something. I think the other thing about it is that what it says about the labor movement is just absolutely retrograde and backward. I don't think it's fatal because the American labor movement, in particular the Teamsters, has never been a great advertisement for union reform and in organization. It's not an accident that when Ron Carey was leading the union and it was rechristened the New Teamsters, and when we won the 1997 strike, that there was an open talk about, well, the Teamsters can now organize FedEx right now, and people didn't even mention something called Amazon, right? So when the unions are fighting and there's a sense of forward movement and there's a sense that the union represents not just simply its workers but has a larger social agenda, that's when we can probably make big gains. So I would say that while I see this as a sort of immediate catastrophe for the fight at UPS and its implications for organizing people into the Teamsters, I think that the more overarching story this year, the teacher strikes, the hotel strikes, and the other workers, that's the big story this year. And hopefully when we look back upon it a few years from now, that this is a small bump in the road for a rebuilding of our labor movement in this country.
And not to dwell on the negative here, but I just want to bring back that Amazon story because, again, it just shows the danger here. So you pointed out earlier that, almost simultaneous as this UPS contract was forced down the throats of its members by the Hoffa leadership, that will result in $13 an hour as the start wage for some of the UPS employees. Jeff Bezos, in his magnanimity, announces that, his non-union employees are going to be
the richest man in the world.
Right. Are going to be receiving at least $15 an hour. So the message that sends the working class is, if you're a member of a union, you get paid less than if you're with the enlightened capitalist who will bestow upon you, high wages. That's a very, very disturbing.
Well, that's what they would like you to. That's what the media would like you to say.
Right,
and of course, there are going to be some people who understand that. Who take that message. I think it's important, however, when we pull back the lens a little bit, is that we have to say that however limited the Amazon's new start wage of $15 an hour for both full-timers and part-timers, that in some ways this is a victory for us. Okay. Because $15 an hour has been a demand that was brought up by the militants in the labor movement about a decade ago, which was seen as a pie in the sky, outrageous, silly demand and it's been either won on a local level or it has been the benchmark for achieving higher wages for part-time for service workers in particular across the country. So the fact that Bezos actually capitulated to something that had been a demand of people campaigning for the last decade, I think is important. It also tells you something about what they're worried about and in terms of the working conditions at Amazon, because we all know that it was only a few years ago, before Bezos bought Whole Foods, that there was something of a national campaign to organize Whole Food workers. Some of us knew the people who were involved in that here in Chicago, and the release of that video, this anti-union video that Bezos had been circulating among Whole Foods employees, tells you that there's a certain nervousness. Now, we have to give credit where credit's due, is that Bernie Sanders brought this up back in the summertime when he held a national town hall meeting and highlighted Amazon along with several other employers for not just their poverty wages, but their horrendous working conditions. And so Bezos is feeling the heat, both from the outside and something from the inside. And it really is a question of, like in any organizing drive, it begins with the workers organizing themselves and then finding a union that they think will represent them the best.
UPS workers in Chicago, of course, have a separate contract, different from the national agreement with UPS. Our listeners may have heard that locally a strike vote was taken and that passed. So where are we now with the sort of Chicago contract?
And then we add to that too, just because we only have about 5 minutes to go. That's a really good point, Andrew, and I'm kind of tailored into that too. What is the fight back looking right now? Because I know there's a lot of people right now, even nationally, and teachers are trying to figure out a way to fight back on this, right?
Well, is anybody talking about suing this guy?
I mean, I think there's petitions that have been circulated. There have been calls by the Teamsters United members of the Teamsters Executive Board to have an emergency meeting to override this decision from Hoffa, though I kind of feel like that's really hard to see happening at this point. There's a lot of fury about what to do. And one of the things that's going on is that in Chicago, which has there's two major team UPS locals. One is Local 710, Local 705. Yeah. Local 705 is led by Juan Campos. A few weeks ago, he announced that if there was no movement in local negotiations, where the union has said it's not interested in hybrid drivers and several other things, that they would then be taking a strike vote in early November, which raised the possibility of a local Chicago strike during the Christmas season. This morning, there's a meeting happening right now of the Teamsters Local 705, where I'm sure that there'll be some report on whether what's happening in negotiations and what they can expect in them. So hopefully we can get a report on that soon. Independent contracts have pretty much disappeared outside of Chicago in terms of the Teamsters at UPS. 710 has always been the one that's lagged behind 705 in these things. But if it's the case that if it comes to a strike in Chicago, and we'll learn that fairly soon, or at least a strike vote, that could become a focus for the national opposition to Hoffa on these issues. At the same time, it's very hard for one local union to take on both the International Teamsters Union and a massive, powerful, rich, arrogant, and politically connected employer like UPS. So there's a lot there to consider. I think that the thing I think most frustrating for people is that once the contract was voted down, the real question became, for at least the way I see it, is who was prepared to to walk off the job and take industrial action to start shutting down UPS. And while a lot of the reform leaders did a very good job campaigning against the contract, none of them at this present time are prepared to take that type of job action. Right. So again, I go back to what's happened the rest of this year, and I think the inspiration we can learn more. I think right now from the teacher strikes and the Marriott strikes and the hotel strikes, and take a lesson from the Teamsters that there's still a long way to go in terms of reforming the Teamsters, but that we've learned an enormous amount this year from the teachers and the hotel workers about how to fight and win.
Right. I wish we had more time because this is such an important topic, but it's not one that we're leaving with this discussion. This is going to be an ongoing thing, whether it's the fight back at Teamsters or whether it's the wider implications of what's happening there. So, Joe, thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you, guys.
Andrew, thank you for helping out today, too. That's all for today's program, but you can always find out more about the issues, organization, and people we discuss here on Labor Express by going to our website, which is laborexpress.org. Labor Express is a nonprofit 501c3 member of IBEW Local 1220. The views expressed on Labor Express are those of its producers, and that's those of IBEW. Labor Express is a production of the Committee for Labor Access in Chicago, the world capital of the labor movement. The songs are theme is called Worker Songs, written by Ed Pickford and recorded by the Dropkick Murphys. Tune in next Sunday at 8 p.m. for another edition of Labor Express.
Yeah, this one's for the workers who toil night and day, by hand and by brain, to earn your pay, who for centuries on past for no more than your bread, have bled for your countries